We continue now at the top of Daf Chavav Amud Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 26a. And the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing a contradiction between two brises. The first brisa says that if dam becomes tameh, that's dam of kodshim, and then it is thrown. So if it's done b'shogeg, then we say hurtza, that tzitz is miratza, and therefore it is accepted. But b'mezid, we impose a fine, and we say that it is not accepted. The second brisa says it doesn't matter if it's b'shogeg or b'mezid, it is accepted. And Rav Sheila on the previous Amud answered that the brisa that makes the distinction between shogeg and mezid, which is the first brisa, that's talking about a distinction between nitma b'shogeg and nitma b'mezid. If it becomes tameh b'shogeg, then it's accepted. If it becomes tameh b'mezid, then it is not accepted. The brisa which says there's no difference between shogeg and mezid, that's talking about the throwing of the blood. If the throwing of the blood is done whether b'shogeg or b'mezid, that doesn't matter in terms of its acceptance. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here a proof, and this is from the language of the first brisa itself. The brisa said, Dam shenitma, if the dam becomes tameh, the blood becomes tameh, v'zarko, when it is thrown, b'shogeg hurtza, so if that's done by mistake, it's accepted, and b'mezid lo hurtza, if that's done on purpose, then it is not accepted, and it sounds like it's the throwing of the blood that is being done by mistake or on purpose, and if it is thrown b'mezid, it's not accepted. That is against Rav Sheila's approach, because again, Rav Sheila says it depends on whether the tumah happened b'shogeg and b'mezid. It doesn't matter in terms of the zrika happening b'shogeg or b'mezid. And so the Gemara continues and answers, Hachi Kamer, this is what the brisa is really saying. Dam shenitma, if the blood becomes tameh, v'zarku bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, and then it's thrown, and in terms of the throwing, it doesn't matter if it's shogeg or mezid, but what matters is as follows. Nitma b'shogeg hortza, if the tumah happened b'shogeg, then it's accepted. B'mezid lo hortza, but if it happened b'mezid, then it is not accepted. And Rashi explains that Tashma dam shenitma v'zarku kasha l'Rav Sheila. The brisa's wording is a question against Rav Sheila. The katani im zarku b'mezid lo hortza, because again it says if it was thrown b'mezid, it's not accepted. And again the Gemara revises the understanding of the brisa. It really means to say that if it becomes tameh b'mezid, then lo hortza, then it is not accepted. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, nitmu shirah, if the remainder of the karban mincha becomes tameh, nisrfu shirah, if the remainder of the karban mincha is burned, avdu shirah, if the remainder of the karban mincha is lost, kamidas Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, kashera, it is going to be kosher, uchamidas Rabbi Yoshua, but according to Rabbi Yoshua, psula, it's going to be disqualified. And Rashi explains, Kamidas Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, Diyamar beParaketzat Sol, and Rabbi Eliezer says in Paraketzat Sol in Psachim, Dam afal pishein basar, the blood can be thrown even if there's no meat. Hachinami, so we say the same thing over here by a karban mincha, Kometz afal pishein shirayim, the kometz can be burned on the mizbeach even though there's no shirayim. Kesheira lahakter hakometz, it is kosher to burn the kometz. Kamidas Rabbi Yoshua, but according to Rabbi Yoshua, Do'amar imein basar ein dam, he says that if there's no meat, then there's no blood, and imein dam ein basar, if there's no blood, then there's no meat. So again, according to Rabbi Yoshua, it's going to be puzzle, and this is the same Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua that were mentioned in the Shita Mekubetzes on the previous Amud. And we will note as well an alternate gears in the Shita Mekubetzes over here, Ein dam svar macherim, hachinami im ein shirayim ein kometz. Again, Rashi is saying, just like we say im ein basar ein dam, so too by a karban mincha im ein shirayim, if there's no shirayim, ein kometz, there is no kometz. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav says, V'hu shenitmu kol shireh. And the Mishnah, when it says that the remainder of the karban mincha became tameh, it means the entire remainder became tameh. Avol mixas shireh, but if it would just be part of the remainder that became tameh, lo, then we would not say that. Then we would say that the kometz can in fact be burned according to everyone. And the Gemara continues, Kasal Gadaitach, initially we think, Nitzma in, this is true by the case where it becomes tameh, but Ovid V'saraf lo, but in the case where it's lost or it's burned, this is not true. And Rashi explains, V'husha nitmu kol shireh, again, all of the remainder has to be tameh. Hu da'amar Rabbi Yoshua de'pasol lahakter hakometz. That's where Rabbi Yoshua says that it's possible, it's disqualified to burn the kometz only if the entire thing is tameh, but if some is remaining, again, everybody would agree kosher. And then the Gemara said, Kasal kadaytach nitma in, we think that this is true by tameh. Kilomar, what this means to say is as follows. B'nitmu shireh, in the case where the remainder becomes tameh, hu de'amrinon im nishtayer mixas shalo nitma Keshera afilu Rabbi Yoshua. That's where we say that if some remains that wasn't tamei, it's kosher even according to Rabbi Yoshua. Avol avdu ktsas shira, but let's say some of the remainder is lost. O nisrafu, or some of the remainder is burned. Amar Rabbi Yoshua de psula. There Rabbi Yoshua would not make a distinction. He would still say it's psula, it's disqualified. Hoel v'kula bo'inon kayim. We do need the whole thing to remain intact. Midakanaket Rav lashon tumah, and we see this from the fact that Rav specifically chooses the language of tumah. V'lo nakanami lisrof v'ibud demasnis, and he doesn't talk about lisrof, and he doesn't talk about the case in the Mishnah of avdu shira, and so therefore we assume he's specifically talking about the case of tumah. And so the Gemara continues and asks, "My kosavar, what exactly does Rav hold? I kosavar shiura milsi. If he holds that if some remains, so that's significant. So afilu avid v'sarif nami. So even in the case where it's lost or in the case where it's burned, as long as some remains, Rav should say the same thing that Rabbi Yoshua would say kosher. And I kosavar shiura lav milsi. If he holds that if there is some that remains, that's not significant. V'nitzma my time. And what's the reason by tamei? What's the reason why we say that in that case, if some remains, that it's kosher demaratz tzitz, because the tzitz affects the acceptance. But if so, kol shira nami. That should be true if the entire remainder of the mincha is tamei. The same thing, we should say meratz tzitz. Why do we make the distinction by tumah specifically? And the Gemara continues and answers, Liolam kasavar shiura milsahi. Really, Rav holds that shiura, if something is remaining, that is significant. V'nitma, and when Rav said that in the case of nitmu, if there's miksas shireha, so then we say that it's kosher according to Rabbi Yoshua. V'hu adin liavad v'sarif. The same would be true by the case of lost or burned in all of these cases. If some remains, so then we would say that Rabbi Yoshua says kosher. It's not only true by the case of tumah. V'hai dekamar nitma. The only reason that Rav says he talks about tumah specifically, v'hu shenitmu kol shireha avol miksas shireha lo. The reason why he specifies tumah reishayu nakat. That's just because that was the first thing in the Mishnah, and so therefore he discusses that case, but it's true by the case where it's lost and the case where it's burned as well. And Rashi explains, "My kosavar Rav, what does Rav hold? I kosavar shiura milsif. He holds that if something remains, then it's significant." And the Gemara then said, "Reishaihu the nitmu katani b'masnis." And Bereisha, the case of nitmu is the first case in the Mishnah, so that is the case that Rav discusses. And the Gemara continues, Kedetanya, as we learned in the following brisa, and Rashi explains, Kedetanya, Rabbi Yoshua nami machshir, that Rabbi Yoshua also says kosher, heicha de'ika shir, if something is remaining, afilu ba'ovid v'sarif, even in the cases of lost and burned, we're going to see in the following brisa, Rabbi Yoshua admits in those cases as well, not only by tumah, as the brisa says, Rabbi Yoshua says, Kol hazvachim shebetorah, all of the animal karbonos in the Torah, shenishtayir mehen kezayis basar, if there remains a kezayis of the meat, or kezayis chaylev, or a kezayis of the chaylev which is burned on the mizbeach, then that is sufficient, zorek as hadam, that is sufficient to be able to throw the blood. Kachatzi zayis basar, ukachatzi zayis chaylev, if it's just a half a zayis of meat and a half a zayis of chaylev, those do not combine. Eino zorek as hadam, he's not able to throw the blood. Uvaola, by a carbon ola, where everything is burned on the mizbeach, so then we can combine afilu kachatzi zayis basar, ukachatzi zayis chaylev, even if it's a half a zayis of meat and a half a zayis of chaylev, zorek es hadam, one can throw the blood, mimnei shakula kolel, because that's entirely burned on the mizbeach anyhow. Uve minchen, by a carbon mincha, afilu kula kayemes, even if it's all intact, lo yizrok, he shouldn't throw the blood. The Gemara immediately asks on this last line of the brisa, but again, the point of bringing the brisa is that we see that as long as some remains, still the blood is able to be thrown, but the Gemara asks on this last line, mincha, when it comes to the carbon mincha, maya vidita, what does that have to do with the zurikas hadam? By a carbon mincha, there is no throwing of the blood, so that last line doesn't even make sense. It says by a mincha, even if it's all intact, lo yizrok, he shouldn't throw the blood. What is that talking about? Amar Papa says, minchas nesachim. We're talking here about minchas nesachim. What that means is a carbon mincha that accompanies an animal carbon. So accompanying the animal would be a carbon mincha, and also nesachim, also libations. And so therefore, what the Bryce is saying is, salka daitach, one might have thought, hoelu v'hadei zevach ka'asya, since this mincha is accompanying the slaughtered carbon, the animal carbon, so kegufe deziv chadamya, so therefore maybe it's like the carbon itself, and let's say the mincha is remaining, maybe that would be enough to throw the blood of the animal. And so kamash malon, that's what the Bryce is teaching at the end. If the mincha is remaining, that is not sufficient to do this rikas hadam. It needs to be again that the basar or the chaylev, that is remaining, and it has to be a kazayas of those. And the Gemara continues and asks, Menahani Mili, from where do we know this? And Rashi explains, Menahani Mili, from where do we know the imlo nishtayir basar, that if there's no meat remaining, ela chaylev, just the chaylev, the fat that's burned on the mizbeach is remaining, zorek es hadam, that is enough to throw the blood. From where do we know that? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Umatu ba mishum Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. Some have it in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. Amar Kro, it's because the pasuk says, V'hiktir ha'chelev l'reach nichoach l'Hashem. It says that the chelev is burned as a pleasant aroma to Hashem. Chelev v'afal pi shein basar. It means chelev even though there is no basar. And Rashi explains Dechsiv, because it's written V'hiktir ha'chelev reishit dekro hachi. The beginning of the pasuk is as follows: V'zorak hakohen es adam al mizbach Hashem lifnei oel moed. It says that the blood is going to be thrown. V'hiktir ha'chelev, and then it says burning the chelev. Alma d'mishum chelev zorak leiladam. So we see from this pasuk that on account of the chelev, the blood is able to be thrown. That's what we learn from the pasuk. And so again, chelev v'yafal pi shein basar. Even if there's chelev and there's no basar, that's enough to throw the blood. V'yeshkechon chelev. Now we find that this is true by the chelev yoseres u'shtei kloyos menolon. From where do we know this is true? By the lobe of the liver, the two kidneys, those are also burned on the mizbeach. How do we know those are sufficient to be able to throw the blood? To katani, because we learned uva mincha, by carbon mincha, afilu kula kayemes lo yizrok. It says that even if the entire mincha is intact, one can't throw the blood. Again, we interpreted that as the minchas nesachim, but we can infer from there mincha hu de lo yizrok. If there's a mincha, that's not enough to throw the blood. Hayoseres or shtei klayos, but it sounds like if there'd be the yoseres or the shtei klayos that come from the animal, the lobe of the liver, the two kidneys that come from the animal, yizrok, it sounds like we would throw the blood. And so menolan, so where's the source for that? And the Gemara continues and answers, Rabbi Yochanan didayam. Rabbi Yochanan himself says, L'reach nichoach. Again, the pasuk says, L'reach nichoach, that it's a pleasant aroma. Kol shatam ma'ale l'reach nichoach. Anything that ascends, that is brought up for reach nichoach, that is enough to throw the blood. And the Gemara continues, V'itzrich lemichtav chelev, V'itzrich lemichtav l'reach nichoach. It needs to write both. The pasuk needs to write chelev and also needs l'reach nichoach. The cause of chelev, because if it only wrote chelev, hava mina chelev in yoseres u'shtei kloyos lo, then I would have thought the chelev, yes, then the blood can be thrown, but not by the yoseres and the shtei kloyos. So kasav rachmana reach nichoach. That's why the pasuk writes reach nichoach. V'kasav rachmana l'reach nichoach. If it just said reach nichoach, hava mina afilu mincha, then one might think even if the mincha is intact, that's enough. Kasav rachmana chelev. That's why the pasuk writes chelev. And Rashi explains yoseres u'shtei hakloyos minolan. Again, the lobe of the liver and the two kidneys. From where do we know? Dimlo nishtayru elahein. Let's say only they remain. Zorek es adam. Then one can throw the blood. The chazinan lael tahachia. We see earlier that that's true. The katani over mincha afilu kula. Again, you can learn that from the fact that the mincha is not enough. It sounds like the yoseres and shtei kloyos would be enough. L'reach nichoach. The pasuk says l'reach nichoach. V'hiktir hachelev l'reach nichoach. That's the pasuk. Kasav rachmana chelev. So the pasuk writes chelev. Mashma de reach nichoach lo marbi elo dumya de chelev. That already is understood to mean that reach nichoach only includes things which are similar to chelev, meaning de migufe de zavach, that actually come from the animal, and therefore includes the oseres and shtei kloyos, but would not include the accompanying mincha. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Shalo b'klishares, if it's not placed in a klishares, in a vessel, puzzle, then it is disqualified. For Rabbi Shimon machshir, Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher. Hikter komtza pamayim, if the kometz is burned on the mizbeach twice, meaning it's burned in two stages, the first half is burned and then the second half is burned, then kashera, then it is kosher. And Rashi explains, Shalo b'klishares, if it's not in a klishares, this is talking specifically Shalo kidesh kometz b'klishares. We're talking about not sanctifying the kometz in a klishares. There we have a machlokas tanoim. The Tanakama says posel, and Rabbi Shimon says kosher. And Rashi notes the v'tchilas mincha, in the beginning of the carbon mincha, meaning before the kometz is taken. Vadai lo pligi deboy kli. There's no argument. Certainly a vessel is required. Kidamrinan beperek shtei halechem, like we say later on in perek shtei halechem. Shalu as Rebbe Zuminai, and that's what we say later on. And so again, the discussion over here is specifically in terms of the sanctification of the kometz in a vessel. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'reid Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, says, my time with Rabbi Shimon. What's the reason of Rabbi Shimon that it's kosher, even if the kometz is not sanctified in a vessel? Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, Kodesh kadoshim hi kachatos v'cha'asham. It's Kodesh kadoshim, like the chatos and like the asham. And we learn from that pasuk, Bolo ovda biyad, if he wants to do the service with his hand without a vessel, so ovda biyamin, he should do it with his right hand. Kechatos, just like we find by a carbon chatos. Bechli, if he wants to do the the avoda with a vessel, then ovda b'smol, then he can do the avoda with his left hand, ka'asham, like a carbon asham. And Rashi explains, bola ovda biyad, if he wants to do it with his hand, haktaras kometz, this is referring to the burning of the kometz. She b'mekom zrika, that is in the place of zrika, that is instead of throwing the blood by an animal carbon. Biyad shalo kitchu b'kli, so if he wants to do it with his hand, meaning he doesn't want to sanctify it in a vessel, so ovda biyamin kachatos, the point is he can do it without a vessel, he should just do it with his right hand. Shavoved nami zrikasa be'etzba, the chatos, the zrika of the chatos is also done with the right hand, it's actually done be'etzba with the finger, that's how the blood is applied, uviyamin, and with the right one. Again, it says in the pasuk, he takes from the blood with his finger, ve'amrinan, and we say in Zvachim, kol makom shenamar etzba ukahuna, anytime it says etzba and kahuna, eina ela yamin, it means the right. Alma mida akshal chatas, and the point is we see, from the fact that the minchas compared to the chatas, shema mino de lo boi kli, we see from here that a vessel is not required, uvilvad she'avdenu biyamin, as long as the service is done with the right hand. Bismol ka'asham, if he wants to do it with a vessel, then he can even do it with a left hand, like an asham. Shezrikaso bikli, the carbon asham, the throwing of the blood is with a vessel. Velo biyad, it's not done with the hand. It's only by the chatas that it's done with the hand, but by the asham, it's thrown with a vessel. De'ein lachton matnas etzba ela chatas bilvad. The only carbon that requires application of the blood with the finger is the carbon chatas. Dehachei amrin bezvachim, that's what we say in Zvachim. Del Rabbi Shimon zrika ksheira, it means that according to Rabbi Shimon, the throwing of the blood is kosher even with the left hand. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Zorak bismol pasul, if he throws with his left hand, according to the Tanakama, it's pasul, it's disqualified. For Rabbi Shimon machshir, but Rabbi Shimon says kosher. Mishum deveshar zrikas hakarbonos, because by other throwings of the karbonos of the blood, loksiv etzba ela kahuna, it doesn't say etzba, it's only written the word kahuna. Well, Rabbi Shimon kahuna boy etzba, according to Rabbi Shimon, the word kahuna needs the word etzba as well to require the right, and so in this case, the right hand is not required. And the Gemara continues with another answer to explain Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yanai Amar, Rabbi Yanai says, Kevan shekamsu mi klishares, once the kmitza is taken from a klishares, then ma'aleu maktiro, he can bring it up and burn it on the mizbeach, afilu behemaino, even in his belt, va'afilu b'mekida shel cheres, even in an earthenware vessel. Again, the point is, an additional vessel is not needed. And the Gemara continues with a third answer of Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar. Of Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Hakol modim, everybody agrees, bekometz, by the fistful sheton kiddush, that it requires sanctification. And Rashi explains, behemaino is avnet, that's his belt, mekida klicheres, that's an earthenware vessel. And finally, hakol modim bekometz sheton kiddush, the Gemara said everybody admits by the kometz that it requires sanctification. And according to this third approach, v'chi machshir Rabbi Shimon, when does Rabbi Shimon say kosher without a vessel? That's behekter, that's talking about in the burning. Meaning, shim notzlu mitoch klishares, if he takes it from the vessel, la'achar shekitshubo, after it was sanctified, v'haleyu biyado, and then brings it up to the mizbeach with his hand, v'hiktiru, and burns it, kosher, it's going to be kosher. And so according to that third approach, Rabbi Shimon does require a vessel, he just doesn't require that it go directly from the vessel to be burned from there to the mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following brisa. This brisa is going to be a question against the first approach, the approach of Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia. Again, he says that if the avoda of the kometz is done with the hand, it has to be the right hand. If it's done with a vessel, then it can be done with the left hand, according to Rabbi Shimon. This brisa says, Hekter chalavim ve'ivarim, the burning of the fats and the limbs, ve'etzim, and the wood, shehelon, that are brought up to the mizbeach, bein biyad, bein bekli, whether with a hand, whether with a vessel, bein biyaminu, vein besmol, whether with the right, whether with the left, ksher, and they are kosher. HaKometz v'haketores v'halavona, the kometz, which is what we are discussing, and the ketores, the incense, and the lavona, the frankincense, shehelon bein biyad, bein bekli, if they're brought up, whether with the hand or whether with a vessel, bein biyamin, bein besmol, whether with the right, whether with the left, ksher, and they are kosher. And so here we say the right or left hand are going to be kosher regardless whether a vessel is used or the hand is used. To Yuvta de Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia, let us say that this is a refutation of Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia, and the Gemara says, Amar Lach, Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia will respond to you, Litzdad and Katani, the way to learn that brisa is to learn it to its sides, meaning, Biyad, if it's with the hand, then Biyamin, then it has to be the right hand. Bechli, if it's with a vessel, Bein Biyamin, Bein Besmol, then it can be either the right or the left, and if you learn the brisa in that fashion, it is not a question against Rabbi Yehuda B'rei Rabbi Chia. And the Gemara continues, continues at the two dots. Tashma, coming here a proof from the following brayso. So this brayso is going to be a question against the third approach, the approach of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Again, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said that everybody agrees, even Rabbi Shimon agrees, bekometz shaton kiddush, that the kometz does need to be sanctified in a vessel. It can be taken out of that vessel then and then brought up to the mizbeach and burned on the mizbeach by hand, but it must be sanctified in a vessel. And again, this brayso is going to be a question against Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. The brayso says, "Kamsu shalom mikli shares." They change the gears over here to kamso mikli shares. If he takes the kmitza from a kli shares, v'kidsho shalo b'kli shares, and then he sanctifies it without a kli shares, without a vessel, v'helo v'hiktiro shalo b'kli shares, and he brings it up and burns it without a vessel, pasul, then it is disqualified. Rabbi Elazar of Rabbi Shimon machshirin b'matan kli. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, they say kosher if it's placed in a vessel. And Rashi explains, kamso mikli shares, if he takes the kmitza from a kli shares, sheniskacha bo hamincha, meaning the carbon mincha was sanctified in a vessel, he takes the kmitza from there. And then we have the opinion of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon that machshirin b'matan kli, they say it's kosher b'matan kli, meaning afilu shalo b'kli shares. What that means is even not in a kli shares. Tiyufta de Rav Nachman, that's a refutation of Rav Nachman, the Amar HaKol Modim, who says HaKol Modim. The way the Gemara initially interprets the brayso is that Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon are saying that the kli is not needed, and the Gemara continues and revises what the brayso means. Ema rather say that the brayso should read as follows: Mimatan kli va'elach, from the matan kli and onward, which means as follows: Mimatan kli va'elach holocha v'haktara lo ba'inan kli sharis. It just means that the conveying it to the mizbeach and the burning it on the mizbeach, that does not need a kli sharis, but it does need to be sanctified in a kli sharis. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here another proof from a brayso. This also will be a question against Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. The brayso says, V'chachamim omrim, the chachamim say, Kometz ton kli shares, the kometz requires a kli shares. Keitzad, how so? Komso mi kli shares, he takes the kometz from a kli shares, umekadsho b'kli shares, and then he sanctifies the kometz in a kli shares, umalu umaktiro b'kli shares, and he brings it up to the mizbech and burns it in a kli shares. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Kevan shekomso mi kli shares, once he takes the kometz from a kli shares, malo umaktiro shalo b'kli shares v'dayo, he can bring it up and burn it without a kli shares, and that is sufficient. Again, that sounds like the kometz does not need to be sanctified in a kli shares. And the Gemara continues, Amos say instead what the brayso should say is kevan shekamsu v'kidshu b'kli shares, once the kmitza is taken and it is sanctified in a kli shares, then malo umaktiro v'dayo, then he could bring it up and burn it, and that is sufficient. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here another proof from a brayso, kamatz biyamino, if he takes the kometz with his right hand, v'nasan b'smolo, puts it in his left hand, yachzer liyamino, he should return it to his right, b'smolo, in his left hand. And Rashi explains, Tashma Rav Nachman, again this proof also is with regards to Rav Nachman, v'nasan b'smolo, he places it in his left, below kli, without a vessel, yachzer liyamino, he returns it to his right, kedamrinan la'el, bala ovda biyada ovda biyamin. Like we said earlier, if he wants to do the service with his hand, he should do it with his right hand. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chavav Amud Beis.